Welcome to this segment of Recovery TV. Today we're going to explore this notion of childhood trauma and how the wounded child within us can often be a real jerk. So that's coming up, so stay with me. Hello, I'm grateful to have you here. My name is Josh Nichols. I'm a licensed marital and family therapist and a certified sex addiction therapist. We have all heard of and often made reference to this notion of the inner child. And we often do that in jest, kind of just in general conversation where we might be visiting with friends or family about certain issues, but it's not something I think we often take really seriously. Well, surprise, the inner child does exist, and he or she can often be a real jerk. And that's what I want to talk about with you today. But before we begin, I'm going to encourage you to stay to the very end of this video. One reason is just to hear about how the 1980s hit movie Flatliners plays into all this. But more importantly, I want you to hear about this tip that I have to share with you to help you take the power away from that wounded child so that you can reclaim your true self. But before we discuss why I believe the inner child is a jerk, we probably need to establish what I mean when I refer to childhood trauma. First of all, my definition of trauma is any difficult life event or experiences that you know you'll simply never forget. That means the traumas we experience can seemingly range from small and insignificant, like that time when your second grade teacher embarrassed you in front of the whole class, to large and very dark traumas, like in the cases of childhood sexual abuse or physical abuse, or even extreme emotional and physical neglect. So when you think of trauma like that, then that means that all of us have probably experienced trauma in our childhood. Even those of us that grew up in the best of families and circumstances have experienced a good dose of childhood trauma before we reach adulthood. But now you're wondering, what does that have to do with my inner child, if that is really even a thing? Well, it is a thing, so allow me to explain. When we are a child and we start experiencing the hardships of life, whether small to large, we start making promises to ourselves. Maybe your dad was a workaholic and never around, and so you made a promise to yourself, when I grow up, I'm going to be the best dad ever. I'll always be there for my kids. Maybe you experienced the hardship of divorce. So you made a promise to yourself, when I grow up, I'm going to have a family that stays together forever. Or maybe you were bullied and you made a promise to yourself, when I grow up, I'll never be that powerless again. And there are so many more. Sometimes these are conscious problems that we make to ourselves. In other words, we're very aware that we made them. So you might even be able to think back on some of the promises you made to yourself, and those come back to you very easily. But a good portion of them are usually subconscious or unconscious. In other words, you don't remember making that promise, but you did. Now the kicker is that after we make those promises, we often find ourselves spending a good portion of our adult lives trying to make good on those promises, only to find ourselves falling miserably short a good portion of the time. So why is that? Well, I'll tell you. Because we were children when we made those promises. We were inexperienced, immature little kids. The promises we made to ourselves as kids are riddled with ambiguity, unrealistic expectations, and a general lack of understanding of how the world really works. Thus, we set ourselves up to fall short. But when we fall short, that inner child, you know, the one you made the promises to, can be relentless and even brutal in holding you to your word. This is the part where I'm going to talk to you about just how big of a jerk your inner child can be. But before we begin, I want you to stop what you're doing and see if you can find a picture of yourself when you were a kid. Let's say around the age of 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, somewhere in that time frame. And I want you to notice the innocence that you see in yourself in that picture. Sure, some people were difficult children to raise. Some people were very ornery and hard on their parents. But you were innocent nonetheless. There is an innocence about you. And I want you to see that innocence in that picture of yourself. And the reason why is because Yes, that was the child that made those promises, but that is not the child you are dealing with now. The inner child you are dealing with now is relentless and ruthless and cruel and frankly a big a-hole at times. And when you fall short on your promises, he or she will make you pay. In the late 80s, early 90s, a movie entitled Flatliners came out. It's a fascinating story about a group of med students that wanted to better understand the experience of death. And so they concocted this crazy idea where they would inject each other with some kind of serum that would make their heart stop, hence the title Flatliners. And they would leave them in that state of being for several moments before they resuscitated them back to life. Now that's a crazy, ridiculous, and dangerous thing to do, and something I'd never recommend anybody doing. But it was interesting what happened after they had their first experience with flatlining. It somehow opened the door to all their demons, and a lot of them were having to deal with their childhood demons. So a good portion of the movie is about these med students that are having to go and face their demons so that they can heal from those experiences and move on from them. But one thing that makes the story really interesting is that there's a character whose demon or whose childhood traumas actually come back to haunt him literally in a way where it actually is inflicting physical violence upon him. He'll show up somewhere to meet his friends and he's got all these cuts and bruises on him because his childhood darkness is literally beating him black and blue. And it's not until they face their darkness and their traumas head on before they are able to move on with their life in a healthy, productive way. The point I want to make with this is that when you don't uphold your end of the bargain with that inner child that you made those promises to, he or she will figuratively beat you black and blue for not making good on your word. So what it really boils down to in doing childhood trauma work is you coming face to face with that inner child to convince him or her to let the grown-up off the hook. You have been on the hook too long for promises that you made when you were an immature little kid, and you were never going to be able to live up to those. It's time. So I wanted to share with you a tip on how you can start that journey. The first thing to do is to find a good therapist, and I've put links in the description of this video below to several therapist directories that are reliable where you can search out therapists in your area to help you with your trauma and other issues that you might be dealing with. Then allow your therapist to help you recall and process through those difficult childhood experiences. Then ask yourself, what were the childhood promises I likely made to myself after having those experiences? Then write it down and continue to process these promises with your therapist. I'm giving you this tip in effort to help you get started, but you're not out of the woods yet. So I'd encourage you to stay with your therapist that knows how to work with trauma and continue to do trauma work along the way so that you can get the healing that you deserve so that you can live a healthy, happy, and productive life. Thanks for being with us today. I'll see you next time.